Hi, everyone. My name is Travis Steffens, and I'm the Regional Director for Ontario Nunavut for the Explorers Club. And we're having our monthly virtual meeting. Tonight, we'll have Andrea Reid as a guest speaker. But before I introduce her, I would like to pass it over to our chapter chair, George Krunis, who has a small announcement.
Thank you so much, Travis. And I want to thank everyone who's tuning in from across Canada or wherever in the world you happen to be watching us on the YouTube channel. A couple of small things. We just had our annual general meeting of the Canadian chapter mere moments ago. If you were unable to attend, don't worry about it, because I will be ensuring that my annual report is available to every single member of the chapter, and that will be in your inbox probably in the new year, because I wait until the end of the year in case something interesting or crazy happens between now and New Year's Eve. So look for that in your inbox. If anyone has any questions ever at any time, I'm reachable. However, chapter chair at explorersclub.ca if you have any kind of questions about that. If you are tuning in live right now, tomorrow, being Saturday the 12th, is the club's big annual general meeting. So please do tune in if you can. I know the notice for that meeting did go out kind of late because of some voting on some bylaws to see if we could actually have that meeting. Well, we are having the meeting. So look in your inbox. There should be a link there. It was sent a couple of days ago, and that'll take you into the Zoom link to tune in. It's 11 o'clock Eastern time zone tomorrow, Saturday, December 12th. And that's it for announcements right now. I wish everyone a joyous holiday season, whatever you celebrate. I hope you and your family are healthy, happy, and prosperous now and into the new year. And I see light at the end of this dark tunnel that we've been in that we call 2020. So thank you all so much. Travis, back to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, George. Well, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today. We've met in person once, and I was very excited that she agreed to come give a talk to us. We'd prefer to be in person, but being virtual is the next best thing, and this way we can actually reach more people over a greater time period. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Andrea Reid, who is a citizen of the Nisga'a Nation and is an incoming assistant professor at the University of British Columbia's Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, starting in January of 2021. There she will lead the Indigenous Fisheries Research Unit, working to build a national and international hub for the study and protection of culturally significant fish and fisheries. Her research program adopts highly interdisciplinary and applied approaches to improving our understanding of the complex interrelationships between fish, people, and place. Reid's PhD in biology from Carleton University centered on multiple stressor effects on Pacific salmon, using tools and insights from Western and Indigenous science in tandem. Reid is a co-founder of Riparian, a Canadian charity that connects diverse young women with science on the water to grow the next generation of water protectors. She is also a National Geographic Explorer and a grantee of numerous grants from them, and a fellow of the Explorers Club as well. A fellow in 2019. Looking online, you'll notice that she has a number of publications in various journals, including a highly cited publication in Biological Reviews, where she looks at the emerging threats and facing freshwater biodiversity. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce her today, and very excited to hear about the work she's been doing.
Thanks so much. I'm just gonna share my screen and make sure everyone can see that okay. Is that all good, Travis?
Looks great, thank you.
Yep.
Great, thanks so much. So neat. Amwilla Willina, hello, how are you? It's my absolute pleasure to be here. I do wish we were in person, but I'm very delighted to be invited to present at the Explorers Club Toronto for this virtual meeting, which I believe involves the Ontario and Nunavut regions. I'd like to thank Travis for the great introduction and for finally tracking me down and putting me on the schedule for tonight. So I'm joining you now from the territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish peoples, what's now known today as Vancouver, And I welcome you all to take a moment to consider where you're joining from now, whose lands and waters are beneath your feet, and whether you too live in a place where a colonial name has supplanted the original names of where we are. But perhaps not. Maybe you're joining from Ottawa, which comes from the Algonquin word Adawe, which means to trade because of its significance geographically as a major trade route for thousands of years prior to colonization. Or perhaps Toronto, from the Mohawk language, meaning where there are trees in the water, in reference to fishing weirs, given its history as a place where there was once an abundance of fish, pretty similar to Iqaluit, which I've learned means the place of many fish in Inuktitut. So wherever you're joining from, welcome. And I encourage everyone who doesn't know where they're situated to situate themselves, to find out where and whose territory you're on, what the original place names were or are, and what they mean, as we can see that they can tell us a lot about a place, its history, without even seeing it. They can tell us about our surroundings, our relationship to them, and so much more. Many of you will have heard land acknowledgements before. Maybe some of you are even growing tired of hearing them, but they're not meant to be shallow or canned repetitions of the same phrase over and over again. It's not a box checking exercise. They're truly an invitation to interrogate our own positionality, to check our privilege at a time when it's scarcely been more important to do so. Land acknowledgements, they can be made meaningless if they're not made to carry meaning, but they can also be powerful potential sites of disruption, in the words of Métis writer Chelsea Vowell, if we allow them to be, but that's a big if. I reckon that I'm speaking to many people right now who consider themselves to be storytellers. So why not tell a good story, the real story of what brings us into this present moment? For too long, Canadians have been telling stories that paint us in a rather generous light. And while, yes, we have many strengths to celebrate, we've also done some unimaginable things, some horrible things that characterize much of our history. Stories carry with them a tremendous power to create a reckoning. In the beautiful words of the great Cherokee and Greek writer Tom King, once a story is told, it cannot be called back. Once told, it is loose in the world. So you have to be careful with the stories that you tell, and you have to watch out for the stories that you are told. We in North America have long told ourselves stories of pre-contact wilderness, intact, untouched by human hands, failing to recognize the presence and very active role of Indigenous peoples as stewards of whole ecosystems through everything from fire management to clam gardening to fish egg translocations. We've minimized what is truly Indigenous management and stewardship, likening it far more to mystics or folklore rather than a precise science based on the best available evidence. We've privileged one way of knowing and thinking above all others, claiming objectivity, freedom from bias, and definitive superiority when all science is governed by the values and worldviews of the society from which it emanates. And these values, they shape everything from the questions that we bother to ask and to research, to how it is that we go about answering them, to what we do with that new knowledge once acquired. I think that we as storytellers all share a responsibility to tell stories well, with honesty, examining our own positionality and values and being transparent about them rather than pretending that they don't exist, and confronting our pasts and our presents so we can begin the reckoning that's needed to move forward in a better way. So with that sort of winding preamble in which I've woven in various contexts, I'm now going to walk you through what I'm here to share with you today, the story that I'm here to tell. And that's my journey as a fisheries scientist who's reconnected with her Indigenous roots, heritage, community, family through her science research and storytelling on fish. So I'll start by telling you that while I am now a proud citizen and member of the sovereign Niska Nation, which sits just at the base of the Alaska Panhandle, and centered in the beautiful Nass River Valley, where my ancestors on my father's side all hail from the village of Gingolth, also known as the Place of the Skulls. I was not raised here. I didn't grow up in ceremony or speaking Niska. I didn't even know our fish, the salmon, who I now also know as Han in the Niska language. Instead, I grew up nearly as far away as one can without leaving the country, nearly 3,000 miles away as the crow flies on Prince Edward Island, or what is also called Abagwit in Mi'kmaq, meaning cradled on the waves. But I still grew up in a small coastal community where water and fish were deeply connected to the people. I grew up with it, grew up loving it. So it was only natural that it then define what I would go on to do and make the focus of my career. As soon as I learned that I could snorkel, dive, turn rocks over, paddle, and travel the world, all for work, all in search of strange and wonderful fish in order to protect them and all that they underpin, I was completely hooked. Fortunately, early in my career, I had outstanding mentors who play such an important role in an academic's life, who put me on the path of the National Geographic Society and their funding streams, basically from the get-go. My first grant with them brought me to East Africa, to Uganda, to the world's second largest lake, Lake Victoria, where I would study over the course of my master's based out of McGill University in Montreal, the impacts of this massive invasive predator, the Nile perch, Lades niloticus, and its impacts on native fish in the basin, like this haplochromine cichlid, Pseudocrenolabrus multicolor, also known as blue lips for rather self-evident reasons. The Nile perch, as many of you may already know, thanks to a famous documentary called Darwin's Nightmare, caused the extinction of hundreds of native fish species, literally eating them out of house and home. And I was here to examine how these really tiny but tough creatures would use low oxygen wetlands as a protective refuge from Nile perch predation, who is a little bit of a wuss when it comes to low oxygen environments, or what we call hypoxic environments. So this experience, it marked a notable turning point for me, as it was my first real awakening to the knowledge of fishers. I worked closely throughout my field seasons here with one fishing family in particular, the Mutebis. This is their patriarch Jackson, who essentially guided me the whole study long. They knew when and where and how to fish. I did not. Things being pronounced unknown to science or often appeared to be common knowledge or unmysterious to those that I worked with. Of course, I grew up with fishers all around, but sometimes it takes being on the other side of the world or seeing the world through a whole new lens to see what's always been right in front of you. My next big venture with Geographic was to the Solomon Islands, just east of Papua New Guinea, where my team and I would dive on some of the world's most biodiverse and truly exquisite reefs on the planet. Visiting places like this, Tetapare, or what is known as the last wild island, the largest uninhabited island in the South Pacific, all in search of this mysterious and rapidly vanishing fish, Bulbometopon muricatum, bumphead parrotfish, that plays essential roles on reefs, kind of like the pollinators of the sea sort of thing, but for coral. But they apparently taste a whole lot like lobster, so they've faced tremendous fishing pressure in recent years. So we were diving to find them and understand the circumstances in which they're doing well versus those where they were doing poorly. And for the most part, it was bad news, and photographs like this one that I'm sure make any underwater photographer cringe were among the best shots that we could get. We saw them so rarely, often at a major distance or in waters too deep to get half decent light. That is until we went to Tetapare, that last wild island where Solomon Islanders have created and now own and manage what is considered to be the conservation jewel of the South Pacific. And the fish were just huge, traveling in enormous herds. We could hear them crunching along the reef as they approached. We snorkeled with dugongs and spinner dolphins. The biodiversity was just truly incredible. And the whole time we were once again guided, warmly welcomed, and rapidly schooled by those that live it. It was among the most remarkable places that I've traveled to with diving that I just haven't experienced anywhere else. So anyone looking for a post-pandemic place to visit, Solomon Islands should be on your list. My next project with the Society therefore put fishers at the very heart of the story. So off to the Philippines and Indonesia, my team and I went to tell the story of fish like this, Paracanthoris hepatis, or dory, the blue tang, also known locally as letter 6. And it was centered on how fish like these got from places that look like this to ones like this inside of people's home aquaria on the other side of the world. And if we just pause on this close up for a second, you can see why the blue tang is known locally as letter 6. If you kind of tilt your head to the right, you can clearly see that there's a 6 on the side of the blue tang, and it got a little bit muddled in translation, so it's referred to as letter 6. And that is Finding Letter 6 is the title of a forthcoming short documentary film that my team and I have put together that we're currently entering into the film festival circuit. So we'll be happy to share that in future days. And all of this was part of a large collaborative National Geographic project intuitively called Reef to Aquarium. You can check us out at reeftoaquarium.com, where we have an interactive website that walks you through the trade and all of the specifics and what we learned and found here. But ultimately, this was about what these fishers go through to get these fish, how well they know their home reefs, and the specific dance or strategy that's required to catch a certain species at a certain time in a certain place that might fetch a better price to support these fishers and their families. Holding their breath while working for minutes at a time while we scuba dived in like utter amazement alongside of them. They were truly incredible free divers. Learning from them why they engage in the aquarium trade, what needs to happen to make it more sustainable, working closely with groups like the Indonesian Nature Foundation or LINI, and ultimately learning how we can transition ourselves from a potentially harmful practice to one that sustains fish, people, and their livelihoods in the process. I could feel my worldview starting to shift even more as I navigated this work. I was being pulled into this work because I love everything to do with fish and water, yes, but I fundamentally was being drawn into it because it's so deeply human. Fisheries, the occupation of catching fish, they simply don't exist without people in the mix after all. I began to wonder and ask myself how I could begin to center my own work with my own people, and on a fundamental level, why I was off doing this work on the other side of the world when we share many of the same fisheries conservation issues here at home. Why am I now an adult and I still haven't set foot in the territory from which my father, my grandmother, my Gigi, and all of our ancestors going back millennia? Why have I not been here before? Of course, there are reasons that involve the colonial tools of forced assimilation at work. There was the residential school system that removed my grandmother from this community at a young age, and the 60s scoop, which removed my father from my grandmother. But I now needed to confront my own responsibilities and connection to this place that I had, of course, heard of since I was a little girl. My father would tell my brothers and me about the volcano that erupted hundreds of years ago, Canada's most recent volcanic eruption, I'm told, but George can correct me if I'm wrong. And today this volcano leaves behind these vast lava fields where one would otherwise expect a lush rainforest. These are now considered sacred burial grounds for the over 2,000 Nisga'a lives that are found below it that were claimed by the eruption. And this history is also tied to oral histories in our nation, or Arawak, that positions the volcano as a response or lesson precipitated by young children putting sticks on fire into the backs of spawning salmon and watching them kind of zip around as they swim upstream. They thought it was a joke, but the lesson here was that we don't play with fish or put in jeopardy the well-being of lives that we consider to be relatives with whom we have lived in reciprocal relationship for as long as time has been kept or longer. I knew bits and pieces of these stories only. I had never set foot here, and it was time to turn that around. So I positioned my doctoral research based out of Carleton University and the University of British Columbia to center on the mighty Nass River, home of the Nisga'a Nation. It's a river so named because of the Tlingit word nasi, which means intestines or guts, in reference to the river's massive food capacity in its fish. Characterized by ancient fish preservation techniques that are alive and well today. This is my older brother, Christopher, participating in the preparation of ulican grease, which everyone in the nation equates to what olive oil is to the Greeks, ulican grease is to the Nisga'a. But also for coastal peoples throughout the Pacific Northwest, the same is said to be true. So my work for my PhD, it took two main avenues. The first centered on improving our understanding of the fate of salmon in real time using Western scientific technologies like radio telemetry, where we would implant radio transmitters like you see here inside the bellies of salmon just as they re-enter the rivers where they were born. At this point in their migration, they completely cease feeding and they pour all of their energy into fighting the river current so they can get home to reproduce and bring about the next generation. So that allows us biologists to leverage the biology of these fish to implant radio tags inside their bellies at this point in their migration, allowing us to avoid surgery or other more invasive methods that might cause more harm to the fish. So my team and I went out on these big commercial marine vessels that catch hundreds, if not thousands of salmon at any given time. But because there are harvest restrictions in place for certain species of salmon in certain areas and at certain times, it would often mean that fishing crews would have to return hundreds of salmon back to the water when there are specific species or stocks that are at risk. And these salmon bycatch, those were the ones we were really interested in studying. So we would tag those ones before they would be released, and then use radio towers that we put in strategic places throughout the watershed, as well as mobile radio antennas and receivers to listen for fish so that we could see who makes it all the way to spawning grounds versus who only makes it part of that way and why. So we could relate these survival outcomes back to the characteristics of the fish themselves. And we learned a few key things along the way, such as females were less likely to make it home than male salmon were, that fish with fin injuries, they were also less likely to survive. And those fish that had longer capture experiences, that spent more time in the net of the fishing vessel upon initial capture, they were also less likely to make it home successfully. And so from these pieces of information, we can identify clear tipping points that we're now working to build into management and policy locally. Prior to this work, the mortality of bycatch following release wasn't accounted for in the management models used to govern the fishery, but now a mortality factor of 15% based on our work has been applied to account for the full impacts of this fishing activity. So for every 100 fish, that means that 15 fish aren't making it home. And 15 fish might not sound like a whole heck of a lot, but during the time of when we started this work in 2016, in this one area, over 46,000 sockeye salmon were released in this way at this time over a 2-week period, which translates to almost 7,000 fish not making it back, 7,000 fish that are unnecessary mortalities. So if we look at what could be happening on a much larger scale, on a province-wide scale, those numbers can add up pretty quickly. We worked really closely here with the Nisga'a Fisheries and Wildlife Department, who have been in operation for nearly 30 years now. And they helped us monitor for our fish using this really cool tool called a fish wheel, which is powered by the river's current, and it scoops up fish in a way that minimizes harm or stress. The nation has 6 of these tools that are actually ancient fishing technologies. They used to be made out of cedar and nettle fiber. Now you can see that they're made out of aluminum and other constructed materials. They're now modernized. And technicians can work on these, work diligently to count, mark, measure, monitor, and release these fish as they're making their migrations home before releasing them back to the river so that they can continue along their migration. So this work not only ground truths our telemetry work that can often include noise or false positives and other kinds of problems, but it also opens up a window to examine one fish multiple times across their life cycle. This team was able to recapture hundreds of our tagged salmon in the wild, which is a pretty wild thing if you stop and think about it, to recapture the same individual salmon, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times along their migration path using these tools. And this allows us to see how things like injury or disease in the fish are changing over time and space, making it a really unique data set, and we don't know of another quite like it. And we can relate these outcomes, injury and disease, back to those survival outcomes. So those are things that we're working on right now and really excited about next steps. But this work is invariably just a snapshot of how things look right now. But in my doctoral work, I wanted to go more deeply into the human dimensions of this work to understand the critical history and stories. So the other major focus of my dissertation centered on Indigenous knowledge systems, on learning from chiefs and matriarchs in my nation, as well as nations across the province of British Columbia who have lived lives shaped by salmon, so that I could begin to know what they know, to reconnect with this critical part of me and my culture that I grew up without. Some of them even knew stories of my Gigi and could tell me things about my family line, where a trap line was, and allow me insight into something that I grew up without. These are elders who see the world as deeply interconnected, who see the health of the fish as inescapably linked to the health of our glaciers, who see a clear role for youth in being the next generation of stewards of fish and water protectors. They also see me as part of that next generation, helping to bring the others up. I thought I was here making a willful decision to re-enter or enter this world, a choice to find my way back to these roots, but I quickly learned that many saw my return more so as fated, saying, "You think you had a choice? It's in your blood." I was beginning to see the world through 2 lenses, seeing benefits and beauty from bringing together tools and insights from Western sciences and Indigenous approaches to fisheries, which are equally precise and scientific. I came to learn from a powerful, wise, and generous mentor, Mi'kmaq elder Dr. Albert Marshall, about this idea of Etowuptimuk, or 2-eyed seeing. And he provided me with a beautiful framework of how we can embrace multiple ways of knowing in our work, and how this practice can deeply enrich our understanding to find more equitable and sustainable solutions at a time when they are sorely needed. And this work and time with Albert actually culminated in a thesis chapter that's now published open access in the journal Fish and Fisheries on 2-eyed seeing and its transformative potential for fish and fisheries research and management. It doesn't need to be an either or proposition. It can be both. It can be about knowledge coexistence, otherwise known as epistemic pluralism, or more simply put by Cook Islander Thomas Davis, or who's known as Papa Tom, if my ancestors had fiberglass, they would have used it. For me personally, the revelation meant getting to reconcile both parts of me and fulfill my obligations to fish and water and people based on both my East and West Coast origins, or as more eloquently phrased by Tuscarora writer Alicia Elliott in her book, A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, which is a wonderful read. She said, being both Haudenosaunee and white wasn't a curse meant to tear me in two. It was a call to uphold the different responsibilities that came with each part of me. I didn't need to worry about whether to get in the boat or the canoe, and I certainly didn't need to drown in between. Understanding and honoring my unique responsibilities was always the way to keep myself afloat. I had found my way through my work to bring all of me to my science. While my path maybe had a few extra twists and turns than that of the salmon, I've inevitably, and perhaps through intergenerational instinct or memory, returned home. I had in fact written my entire dissertation in such a way that salmon were always referred to as who, as animate, as persons, as relatives, simply because I couldn't bring myself to call them it or that or something inanimate. And it wasn't actually an active choice that I made. It just what was coming out on the page. And I only became aware of this subconscious choice when, during my PhD defense, one of my committee members, who happened to be the one I was most intimidated by, asked me why I had positioned them in such a way. But actually, she was encouraging me to make it an express point in my thesis and to really embrace it. This idea of what Robin Wall Kimmerer calls a grammar of animacy in my writing and in my work. And while I held some secret fear, as many who are in my position do, that an examiner or a committee member might call into question my whole approach to science, the validity and place of Indigenous knowledge systems in the academy, I was floored to later learn that I had been put forward and won both the Governor General's Gold Medal and the University Medal for outstanding graduate work at the doctoral level at Carleton University. And I share this with you now, not to be self-congratulatory, but to make clear that the time has indeed come, or it has perhaps long passed, for Indigenous knowledge holders to be viewed as experts and scientists, for Indigenous knowledge systems to be understood rightfully as science, and of course for fish to be valued as so much more than an it. What I'm ultimately most proud of in all of my PhD work isn't actually contained in the pages of my thesis. It's contained in the camps that I ran with my partner, John Francis, throughout my thesis work that got youth engaged in land-based learning and got them to parts of the territory that some of them had never even seen before. On the sidelines of that, myself and two colleagues, also National Geographic explorers, Dalal Hanna and Michaela Wujek, and I launched a Canadian charitable organization, Riparian, that brings diverse young women on multi-day freshwater science paddling expeditions to grow that next generation of fish and water protectors. And to give you a sense of what we do, I have a quick 3-minute video at the end that I can share if time allows. And then finally, in terms of the road ahead and my next steps, they involve launching the Indigenous Fisheries Research Unit within the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia in January, and getting our first exciting projects and partnerships off the ground, with our ultimate goal being, as Travis alluded to off the top, to build the national or world's hub for the study and protection of culturally significant fish and fisheries, which in my view is pretty well all fish and fisheries. So I'm delighted for what the future has in store in terms of my ability to continue to dive and snorkel and be on and around water and work and learn from fishers. And I'll absolutely look forward to telling you more about what I do in that capacity in future. And I just want to close by being very real about how none of this work was a solo venture. I may appear alone in some of the photos, but all of this work, these ideas, these initiatives, they're truly the products of serial and ongoing collaborations. They are funded by many. They are supported by many more. And this is just a couple of snapshots, and most notably, this wonderful human being, John Francis Lane, who plays a massive and foundational role in all of the work that I undertake. And so with that, I'd like to say Toyuk Sinisum, thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to taking some questions and sharing that video if we have the time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think we definitely have time to see the video. So if you don't mind, we would be happy to see it.
Perfect. George
Yes,
has already seen it. He's gotten a preview.
Hey, Andrea,
Yeah,
should there be sound?
there should be sound. There's not sound.
Okay. Do you want to try
Okay.
and reshare the screen, but look at the bottom for a little box you can tick called share audio, and that should
Mm.
feed it right in.
I was wondering if that might be happening, especially with my headphones. I don't see that
Oh,
box.
Stop the screen share first and then restart it.
Okay.
And before you pick what you're going to share, look for a little box at the bottom, a tick box. There's a share audio and an optimized video. Both of them might be worth clicking.
Sorry, Joe, can you redirect me one more time? Where am I
Yeah.
going?
Yeah, when you click the share screen, it's going to bring up that window where you can pick what to share.
Yep.
Right at the bottom, there should be two little boxes you can tick.
Yes. Gotcha,
found.
gotcha, gotcha.
Sweet.
Thank you. I need to restart it. Sorry. It won't. Let me jump back here.
The sound did come through though, so we got it.
Okay, great. Good.
Good.
What I really loved about the expedition is all the activities we did. We tested water quality, which I don't think I would have the chance to do anywhere else, and I thought it was truly amazing because like water's the most important thing. It's the thing we all have in common, you know? We all need water. And just this whole trip was like an amazing experience.
I like doing all of the science experiments because science is something that really interests me and could be a future job for me. And I really like spending time with all of these young women. We're kind of like a big family in a way, and it was really amazing.
I think my favorite part was like learning about all the like new opportunities we could have done. You know, I really found that like I have a strong interest in like photography, and like I would like to like travel and do that as like, you know, a job. I really liked that we were able to like find out what we wanted to do when we were older, or at least have an idea on this trip.
I think for me, when I come home, I'm gonna have so much bigger understanding of the importance of fresh waters, how important it is to protect them.
So hopefully that wasn't too choppy. I can also share a link after.
Well, that was great. Thank you very much for sharing that.
My
Before
pleasure.
before I pass it on to others, just a quick question about that project itself. How many young women do you get to engage in doing the work you do with that project?
Yeah, so we take typically where our aim is to have 10 or a dozen youth on any given trip. And right now we offer an annual expedition. So we launched in 2019. We had big plans for 2020, but everyone knows what happened that year. So we're just getting ourselves organized for 2021. But really our focus here is on the quality of the experience rather than the quantity of youth that we're putting through this. We're really aiming to provide kind of one-on-one learning opportunities directly with scientists so that these young women can see themselves in those roles and positions.
Great, wonderful. I have a number of questions, but I'm going to actually let others ask for now, and then maybe they'll ask some of the ones I'm interested in as well. So does anyone else have any questions for Andrea?
George.
Go ahead, George.
Two things first off, two statements and then a question. Number one, I couldn't be more proud of what you and Dalal and Michaela and just everything you're doing is fantastic. Keep it up. We will continue to support you any way we can.
Thank you.
In reference to the volcano that you talked about earlier, yes, that is Lava Forks. It's in northwest British Columbia near Stewart, BC. If anyone has been to Stewart, it's a one-way road that basically leads out to Stewart right on the Alaska Panhandle. It's the only place in Canada where you can cross into the US without having to talk to a customs agent. It's a really interesting part of the country. You just walk into the US, basically, or drive across the road. And it did last erupt in the 1800s. Yeah, so that is absolutely spot on. The question, what do you think is the biggest misconception about Indigenous knowledge and how it pertains to science specifically?
Well, I don't know if I'd characterize it as a misperception necessarily, but there's definitely an attitude that it's something that can be used as data and that can easily fit within Western science frameworks, and that we can go into places and tap into these databases, elders' knowledge systems, in order to just use it for Western scientific purposes. And I think that's just really a outdated mentality. There's definitely lots we can learn from these knowledge systems, but they're inevitably tied to the environments that they're based in and to the knowledge keepers who hold them. And so it really comes down to creating really equitable partnerships with those knowledge holders and having them be part of the scientific process and having them shape the questions, shape the methodology. And that's really the nature of community-based work.
Awesome. Keep it up.
Thanks, George. And I was curious, so you've been up to the nation then?
Yes, I was in Stewart a number of years ago. 2012, I was doing a road trip from Toronto to Tuktoyaktuk, and we took a side trip to Stewart with the Weather Network to film with the avalanche control team that takes care of that road that goes into Stewart.
Okay, yeah, you're just you're pretty close to Gingolith, and my family's surname is Stewart, in fact, but I don't carry it because my father lost it through the 60s scoop. But anyhow, that aside, lots of connections.
Nice.
Andrew, thinking about what you shared with some of your earlier projects with getting out and looking at the fish trade and some of the practices that are really damaging, like the poisoning. And then, looking at some practices that are less damaging. I'm curious, do you think it is possible to have a sustainable trade? And do you think that can be, on par with something like ecotourism, which can be used, done sustainably, can help protect those environments?
Yeah, I absolutely think that there are ways that we can have a healthy trade. And I think it really depends on the context. We need to, there are species at risk and species of concern, then those definitely need to not be in the mix. But there are net-based approaches that move us away from cyanide, that many of these groups are spending a lot of time training people in these methods so that they're able to practice it in an efficient way that still helps them, make a livelihood. But in so many cases, the fishers engaged in the industry, they're in this industry not out of choice. It's the lowest barriers to entry. If you're going to go out fishing for harvest, you need a boat, you need fuel, you need all of these things. But for the aquarium trade, you just need the ability to dive and a plastic bag to put the fish in. It's so baseline. So there's so many people who are here because they don't have alternatives. So we absolutely need ways to support them in this and not have them be caught up in the mix around the unsustainable portions of the trade.
Hi, Andrea. Great talk. Thank you so much. It was really nice to hear your story and all the work that you've done. My question is around the impact of COVID, and I know it's impacting your nonprofit and your ability to go out in the field. What impact do you think it will have on the fisheries industry and on these local communities that you work with?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's been a decent amount of talk about COVID impacts on fishing systems, and it kind of depends on where and the context, because in some places it means that some people have more time to like go out fishing, and maybe they're spending more time on it and just getting more fish, and so it's intensifying pressure in places. But in many cases where there's collaborative fishing, then that is just kind of not made possible. So in many communities it puts them in a really food insecure place. If you need 10 people working together to operate that net or that vessel, then that becomes impossible and puts in jeopardy a lot of communities that are highly dependent on salmon and other food sources. Otherwise, things are being flown into these remote places with a high price tag. I wasn't keeping an eye on the chat. Okay, no, it was just about the sound on the video. Perfect.
I'd like to ask you, it was a great talk, by the way, first of all.
Oh, thank you.
What's the condition of the reefs in the Solomon Islands? So many of the reefs around the world have been destroyed or degraded in that very remote reefs system in those remote islands. What's it like there?
Yeah, there were definitely some reefs that we saw that were bleached and unhealthy. But for the most part, they were thriving when we were there, when it was 2014, 2015 when we were there, and beautiful conditions at the time. I mean, things are accelerating really quickly with ocean acidification and changes. So I can't comment on the state now, 5 years later, but then they were in relatively good shape and really interesting systems to dive in terms of the histories there as well. There are innumerable wrecks, and there's an island that Kennedy was stranded on for some time, actually called Kennedy Island, where he survived for, I don't know, 40 odd days on coconuts and things. But a pretty interesting history there because of the war and the position of the Solomon Islands.
Andrew, I had a question for if you had any advice for young researchers who are starting out in their early parts of their career, sort of pre-PhD, and those that might not have Indigenous heritage but would like to connect with sort of a two-seeing approach to their questions. What kind of advice would you give to them to tackle subjects with a sort of pluralistic viewpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question, Travis. I mean, it kind of comes back to that saying that like we're all treaty people. We all have like a role to play in this, Indigenous or not, or of mixed ancestry. I think that there are many things that allies can do and that allies need to do to make space for other ways of knowing. If no one's on the other end making the space, it's going to be really hard for Indigenous knowledge systems to find their way into these places. And so for the most part, what I would recommend younger students who want to engage in two-eyed seeing is to do your homework. There are some amazing books, articles, videos. There's a wonderful TEDx talk by Rebecca Thomas on Etoweptimuk two-eyed seeing. Go watch that, get inspired, learn about the history of it. And my learning with Albert Marshall, he has just really blown me away in his just generosity of spirit and willingness to pass on these teachings. He does not, he technically coined the term in the literature, but he does not claim ownership over it. He is a carrier of the teaching. He is so humble and modest, and he wants everyone and anyone to get engaged with this in the right way. So it really comes down to knowing how to do this work well and how to be a responsible researcher. And there are great resources out there. And I recently published a short newsletter that I could share a link to, but 20 essential reads on two-eyed seeing that are a mix of books and papers on the subject. So that would be a good starting point for younger researchers interested in that line of work.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I think my experience, I've been having students approach me with this interest in a different context. This would be in Madagascar, and so it's always, and I think it's increasing in interest. You know, it's something that I saw some interest in when I was an undergrad, but I'm seeing it as to be much more. Students are much more engaged in the idea now than I think they ever have been.
Yeah, no, and I think I'm seeing that as well. And I think that in all cases, it needs to be approached with a little bit of caution, because we don't want, masses of people descending on communities and increasing burdens that they face. But that all comes with the part of being a responsible researcher and learning what that means and moving through the work in the right way. But yeah, I fully agree with you that there's gaining momentum in this space for sure.
One thing I've always been told is being a good listener doesn't hurt in these situations. That we spend a lot of time as academics talking, but it's quite important to be listening to the whether it's the animals or the people we study.
Yeah, absolutely. Vikrit Berkus has a beautiful book called Sacred Ecology, all about his journey from an ecologist to a community-based ecologist. And in the preface, he talks about arriving in a community with a colleague, and the colleague arrives and says, like, I'm a caribou expert. And that's how they introduce themselves to this community who live with the caribou. And they're like, you know our caribou, you know all of our caribou and all of this history. And it was just, there's an arrogance or a presumptuousness that often comes with trying to be an expert and trying to be a scientist. And we get encouraged into these kinds of ways of thinking that it's really important to think of our own positionality and to check that with ourselves before we walk into these spaces.
Wonderful. Joe, is there anyone peeking on the YouTubes that have any questions?
So we do have some people tuning in live, and they've asked a couple times if this is the spot to put questions. So yep, the chat sidebar on the right, send in those questions and we'll work them in before we wrap up today.
While we're waiting, does anyone else have any questions for Andrea? I've got a question, and if someone wants to jump in, is that Peter? Peter, are you jumping in?
I'll just follow up with my earlier question.
Go ahead.
Is there a dive industry set up in the Solomon Islands? And is it possible to dive there?
To some extent, it's not huge. A lot of the tourism industry to the Solomon Islands is actually for honeymooners. And so I was traveling there with fellow National Geographic explorer Michaela Wujek, one of my best friends, and we were going place to place, and everywhere that we would arrive and book a place for two, we would arrive to petals strewn on our bed, and it would be just one big bed for the two of us, and all of these things that they're not used to people coming there for research. And there was a lot of curiosity as to who we are and what this is all about, but we were working there with really great partners, the Solomon Islands Conservation Community Partnership, as well as another dive-based group that were really fundamental in helping us get to the right places and meet the right people and navigate all of that.
Where do these honeymooners come from? Japan?
Australia is a big one. People show up on some pretty big yachts and that kind of thing. So I think a lot of the tourism industry was like a little bit above what we were looking to looking to do while we were there.
Over to you, Joe.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in with one came in from Vince, and Vince wants to know, what do you think is the greatest risk that migrating salmon face currently?
That's a really good question. I mean, a lot of the evidence is pointing to changing ocean conditions. Our oceans are a big black box in terms of when salmon go out to sea and the numbers that come back. That's a major area of concern. And in recent years, we've had something called the blob, this unexpected, anomalous blob of warm water. And salmon are cold water creatures who like cool waters. And so that's something that could be having impacts on them. But certainly, even though the temperature of our rivers is cause for concern, some of my work has centered on the Fraser River, which I didn't speak of today, but in some summers where I've worked there, the water's been 21 degrees Celsius, which is lethal for sockeye salmon. So we're at a very important tipping point for many of these fish. But I think that there's also a really foundational challenge for these fish, and that's how we position them either as commodity or as relative. We've really commodified salmon, and we manage them in a way that's geared towards maximum sustainable yield of what is the most we can take before we start to see impacts. And that's a really risky way to manage a fish, is what is the limits we could push it to and to use that as the benchmark.
And then we'll jump in here with another question, this time about salmon farming. Is that something that you have come across in the work you've done out on the coast? And then what are your thoughts on that and the environmental impacts?
Yeah, great question. I don't work specifically on salmon farms, but I have part of my work that does look at disease in these fish. We're very much on the front end of that work, so I don't have major results to share in that capacity, but I have some really close collaborators that work at the Pacific Biological Station who are experts in this work. And there is growing evidence to show, I mean, just the placement of many salmon farms in British Columbia, it's in the estuaries and in the river mouths where these are really important holding places for salmon, especially before they're going out to the ocean. And that can be a really sensitive time for the fish. And so if they're exposed to, high volumes of potential microbes, it's definitely a cause for concern. The evidence doesn't look great. It's a very contentious issue. And I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Unless there's any other questions, we can wrap up shortly. But I just have a quick question about your next phase at UBC. How much will you be carrying forward, and how much of a new program will you be building when you move into your new position?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm developing a lot of that now, designing a lot of it now. But a lot of my partnerships, I mean, all of them are focused on community-based needs and desires. And so far I kind of have 3 major projects for the next 5 years that I'll be focusing on. And they're all in response to community needs. So they hinge along the same, or they kind of operate along the same lines as many of the projects that I've talked about in terms of looking at the impacts of stressors on fish and fisheries. But some of them kind of stem into bigger picture, how do we assess ecosystem health? And from a holistic perspective, a lot of our metrics and ways of assessing aquatic ecosystem health or doing stock assessment relies strictly on Western scientific approaches. And I'm working with some nations who've expressed interest in terms of how we bring Indigenous values to the fore of that, and how we create biocultural monitoring frameworks that are more in line with how First Nations view the world. And it's really based on this idea that was spearheaded by the Maori. They have something called the Cultural Health Index that does just that, to bring Maori values and voices to the fore of governance in New Zealand. And so it's applying that framework here. So I'm yeah, on the front end of seeing what's in store, but I've got a growing number of students on these various projects and really excited for this transition, and super pleased that the majority of students reaching out are Indigenous young scientists who are keen to work on these issues. So I'm glad. I thought this was something that I was going to have to work up slowly to over time in terms of recruiting Indigenous students. It can be, there's so many barriers for students to find their way to university, but those that are well positioned to make that leap are already finding me. So I'm excited for next steps.
Wonderful. That's amazing. Unless there's anything else, I'll just give a pause to hear from anyone. It's always hard, and we don't have our body language and cues when we're virtual.
I know. I miss being in a room, but in future, we'll be back.
Well, on behalf of the entire Ontario Nunavut region and the Explorers Club Toronto, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to speak about your work and your experience. And thank you for coming out and sharing this all with us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation, and yeah, look forward to seeing you all when this is over.
Wonderful. Well, this has been another virtual meeting of the Explorers Club Toronto with the Ontario Nunavut region of the Explorers Club. And I want to thank Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants and Joe Grabowski for helping to set up these talks and to make sure we run virtually and get us online on YouTube. So if you want to check them out, you can go to Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants' YouTube channel, and you'll see all of our previous talks there. Thank you very much, and good night.